Santa Maria de Pombeiro was one of the most important Benedictine monasteries of the lands between the Douro and Minho regions, both in wealth and in construction program. The choice of location to establish it shows, to this day, how the monastic communities chose to build on the best agricultural lands, in low-lying areas where agriculture with irrigation could be practiced and there was abundant water. The building of the church as it appears today, despite the various reforms effected in the 17th and 18th centuries, corresponds to a work of the Romanesque period, probably started in the last quarter of the 12th century, but only completed in the first decades of the 13th century. This is what the typology of the rosette of the western portal and the sculpture and elevation of the western portal appear to show. In Pombeiro, the axial portal is an example of remarkable sculpture with regard to the archivolts, in one of which staves are adopted with sculpture that is characteristic of capitals, in the style of the portals of the Cathedral of Braga and of São Pedro de Rates, where this style was created. This church preserves two inscriptions of the Romanesque period of outstanding importance for the understanding of its history. The commemorative inscription of the dedication of the church is to be found engraved on the external face of the nave wall to the right of the north lateral portal of the temple, declaring that the church was consecrated on the 14th of August, 1214. It is a well-designed building of great constructive quality, appearing to be a project that was carried out in one single go. The sculpture of the portal of São Vicente de Sousa illustrates how much the Portuguese Romanesque has effects of great originality, one of its qualities. The Church of Salvador do União, despite the transformations effected to it through the ages that somewhat changed the Romanesque construction, preserved the epigraph that registers the consecration of the church on the 28th of January, 1165. The western portal must be a work of the first half of the 13th century and is comparable to the churches of São Pedro de Ferreira, in Passos de Ferreira, São Vicente de Sousa and Santa Maria de Airens, the latter two situated in the parish of Felgueiras. The capitals, decorated with vegetal motifs, are the best examples of this type of sculpture in all the Romanesque of the north of Portugal. The Church of Santa Maria de Airens is already documented in the Inquirições of 1220 as Ecclesia de Airens in the judgeship of Felgueiras. Interpreting Romanesque effects of the Sousa Valley region, this church, given the late nature of some elements, like the capitals of the axial portal and the frames and capitals of the nave head, must date back to the end of the 13th century or even the beginning of the 14th century. It is therefore an example that shows just how the construction pattern of the Romanesque period had a lengthy permanence in this region. To visit the Church of São Mamede, to think of the patron saint's function of protecting livestock, to observe the surrounding view and the location of the church, is to appreciate the signs of the historical changes of the populations and the economic conditions of this mountainous place, once dedicated to animal husbandry. The Church of Vila Verde is a temple built the Romanesque way, although it belongs to a later period. In fact, it is a building of the 14th century. The mural painting of the Church of Vila Verde, only residual now, shows us how sometimes artists of great quality worked on churches of little architectural ostentation, which is the case of the painter Arnaus, who was responsible for one of the pictorial undertakings. It is strange to note that the church of São Mamede de Vila Verde not only presents a late architectural effect in the repetition of Romanesque forms in the 14th century, but also comprises an exemplar of modernity with respect to painting. In this respect, it is an enlightening lesson in the history of art. According to the inquests of 1258, Sainte Marie of Vilar was a privilege of Dom Gil Martins, of the lineage of the Sousões. The Tower of Vilar, which must date from the Gothic period, is more a symbol of lordly power over the territory than a military construction. The tower is built with excellent stone bonding in granite masonry, showing the monograms of the stonemason. The southeast facade presents a rectangular door opening at the second story level, to which one could climb by means of a ladder. Inside, there are vestiges on the walls that confirm the residential function of this tower, composed of various floors, the last one corresponding to the battlement that encircled the top. The first references to the parish of Aveleda go back to the end of the 11th century. However, the church which we now see corresponds to a much later period. Only the nave remains of the Romanesque building. The most evident Romanesque elements, although very belated, have been preserved on the western facade on the portal. This portal evinces the lengthy persistence of the Romanesque forms which marked, in a particular way, Portuguese medieval architecture. The Vilela Bridge is composed of 4 arches of perfect curve that are supported by 3 pillars reinforced by prismatic piers. Taking into consideration the technical and constructive techniques used, this bridge must date back to the 16th or 17th century, although it is evident that it already existed in 1758, as it is referenced in the parish memorials. The church of Santa Maria de Meinedo must date back to the 14th century. However, it presents an architectural plan which is very attached to resistances of rural Romanesque, which illustrates just how this way of building was, among us, highly valued until later periods. Mention must be made of an image of Nossa Senhora de Meinedo, Our Lady of Meinedo, in limestone that shows vestiges of painting. It is a Gothic sculpture, and the great devotion to it is well documented. The bridge of Espindo over the Sousa River provides a passage between Bustelo and Buin. The bridges of the Gothic period used a trestle structure with an arch or arches of greater amplitude in the center, more systematically, in order to provide greater resistance to the water in a flooded riverbed. Although the bridge of Espindo corresponds to this typology, we must state that its construction must be of the modern period. The church of the monastery of São Pedro de Ferreira is a very singular building of great constructive and decorative value. On the main portal, there are decorative models initiated in the Cathedral of Braga. The sculpture of the archivolts has been compared both with the Archbishop's portal of the Cathedral of Zamora and to the models adopted at São Martinho de Salamanca, as well as with decorative effects that are characteristics of Almohad art. The head of the nave shows a peculiar organization in the panorama of Portuguese Romanesque. The quality of the sculpture of the capitals must be appreciated. Some have narrative engravings, others ribbons and animals, and others still with vegetal decoration that we can see on the lateral portals. This building must date back to between the beginnings and mid-18th century. In front of the principal facade, this church preserves the ruins of an ante-church of funereal function, an excellent and rare testimony of this type of construction that many of our Romanesque churches presented. The foundation of the monastery of São Pedro de Sete goes back to the 10th century. Tradition attributes it to Dom Gonçalo Oveques, who is entombed in the chapel situated at ground level of the tower of the main facade, the arrangement of which dates back to the Manueline period. The church, as it appears today, does not relate to such remote periods. Its construction is already of the Gothic period. As the arrangement of the facade indicates, the proportioning of the length and width of the church and the capitals and animal ornamentation it presents. The reconstruction dates from the 14th century, and it is well documented in the funeral inscription of Abbot Dom Estevão Ange that is embedded on the internal face of the north wall of the main chapel, next to his sarcophagus. The position of this wayside chapel, in a wide flat vale, with a stream running through, now occupied by grass crops and vine, must be related with the devotion to Our Lady of the Valley, showing how this wayside chapel is linked to the agricultural interests of the population of this region. Its feast is on the 8th of September. The building of this wayside chapel may date back to the beginnings of the 16th century, as the head of the nave indicates, or the end of the 15th century. The composition of the portal and the sculpting it presents, however, show the lingering resistance of the Romanesque motifs through time. This is one of the more interesting aspects of this chapel in the context of religious architecture of the Sousa Valley. Vestiges of mural painting subsist in this wayside chapel and can be dated from between 1530 to 1540. Salvador de Passo de Sousa has its origins in a monastery that goes back to the 10th century. It was founded by Trotezino Galindez and his wife Nemia, who adopted the rule of Saint Benedict in 1090. In the context of Romanesque architecture of the Sousa Basin, the church of Salvador de Passo de Sousa, that dates back to the 13th century, is a model monument, as it illustrates a very singular decoration, both with regard to themes and to the techniques used in the sculpting. In this context, Passo de Sousa is a nuclear building where local traditions and the influences of the Romanesque of Coimbra and Porto combine, patterning a sort of localized Romanesque of the lower Tâmega and Sousa rivers. Inside the church, the tomb of Egas Muniz, descendant of one of the most powerful strains of the nobility of the lands between the Douro and Minho rivers, stands out for its sculptured program, narrating his deeds. The Ermida Memorial is situated close to the old road that came from Porto and went through Passo de Sousa, going over the Val Bridge. Tradition associates this monument with the memorializing of the passing of the funeral procession of the Queen, Santa Mafalda, who died in 1256 and was solemnly transported from Porto to the monastery of Aroca. The function of these monuments, although not entirely clarified, probably relates both with the placing of tombs as well as with the celebration of someone's remembrance. Usually situated on roads or at crossing of paths, they consecrate places of passage, which man has always had the need to symbolize. The stylistic characteristics that are manifest in its decoration suggest that it dates back to about the middle of the 18th century. In 1105, there is already testimony to the existence of the Church of Abregão. Popaio Pérez Romeu bequeaths in testament a quarter of Santo Pedro de Araguam to the monastery of Passo de Sousa. This is not the building of the Romanesque high altar that is still preserved today, as this is dated as being of the second quarter of the 13th century, a rebuilding that tradition attributes to the initiative of Dona Mafalda, daughter of the king, Dom Sancho II. The head of the nave is a tasteful piece of Romanesque architecture, both in the careful stone masonry it shows, as well as in the frieze shown on the exterior. The church of São Gens de Boelho, which must have been built between the middle and the end of the 13th century, is a somewhat strange monument in the context of Portuguese Romanesque architecture, which shows us how it has original decorative expressions which are very rural and regionalized. The sculptural exuberance of the animal decorations bears witness to two of the aspects that single out Romanesque sculpture: the taste for variety and the will to impress. The monograms of Boelho, frequent and repeated, suggest that the church was made by half a dozen masons. In the parish of Gandara, the church of Salvador de Cabeça Santa is a good example of Portuguese Romanesque architecture. Made up of a single nave and by a rectangular nave head, both covered by wooden roofs, it corresponds to the most common of the temples built in Portugal in the Romanesque period. It is also a significant testament to the existence of teams of itinerant artists. The arrangement of the portals of this church and the sculpture of the capitals, both of the portals and of the arch that divides the nave from the nave head, are very similar to those in the church of São Martinho de Feita in Porto, that in its turn presents decorative effects that are very unlike those used in the Romanesque construction of the cathedral in Porto. These influences show that this parish church must date back to the first decades of the 13th century. The memorial of Sobrado, or if we prefer, the Marmoiral of Boa Vista, must date back to the 12th century. At the base of the monument, there is the lid of a sepulchre, where a sword and a cross within a circle have been engraved. This type of cross usually had the function of protecting both the tombs and the entrances to the temples in the medieval period. It is a commemorative funeral monument, and its purpose must have been to mark a burial place. Based on the characteristics that the Church of São Miguel de Éja presents, it cannot be prior to the 14th century. It is an exemplar of architecture belonging to the Românico de Resistência that so deeply marks other Romanesque churches of the Lower Tâmega, and where solutions of rural Gothic are apparent, as can be seen in the decoration of the cross arch of the south portal. This church must be contextualized in the territory of the Civitas de Éja, that was an important military and administrative position of this region at the beginning of the Reconquest. Its present aspect is due partly to subsequent additions and alterations, of which we single out the high altar and the bell tower of the mid-17th century. According to tradition, the castle of Aguiar de Sousa was attacked by Al-Mansur in 995. The location of what is left of this old fortification evinces the concerns to defend the territory. The castle of Sousa, of difficult access and surrounded by high mountains that take away visibility, must be associated with the organization of the territory in the process of the reconquest. The inquests of 1258 refer to the judgeship of Sousa, of which the parish of Castelo de Aguiar is part, stating that its dwellers had to ensure the guard of the castle when the king was at war. The vestiges we find today allow us to conclude that it was a square plan building with thick walls of shale masonry.